Greetings, brothers and sisters, and thank you very much for joining Africans Arise. Welcome to you from all different parts of the world where you are, north, east, south, and west. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Today's going to be a really special edition of what I hope will be a series of conversations that I'm going to have with brothers and sisters from across the diaspora called Black Diaspora Groundings. We're going to chop it up on various different issues pertaining to the African diaspora. And in this first edition, I am very pleased to be joined by a very esteemed selection of sisters and brothers, rather. So let me add everyone to the group here. Welcome, Akwaba. Wow. And there you all are. Okay, so yeah, good to see you guys. What I'm going to do, I'm going to give some brief introductions to all of my guests here. I've got some very powerful guests here, so I'm going to read from your biographies, which you've all got online. Most of you have got online. So to my immediate, in the middle of the screen, at the top of the screen, there we have Sister Iyelli Ichile, and Dr. Yeli Ichile teaches history at the Department of Social Sciences at Prince George's Community College. She also serves there as the director of the African American Studies Institute. She has a PhD in the history of the African diaspora from Howard University and a master's in African American Studies from Columbia. Her most important education, however, took place in her mother's home, just like the rest of us. While in graduate school, she developed a research agenda which has been supported by the Smithsonian Folklife Center, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, the Reginald F. Lewis Museum, and several university grants. Very esteemed sister right here. Dr. Ichile has taught at a number of colleges and universities, including Temple, Montgomery College, Virginia Commonwealth University, Florida A&M University, and Goddard College. She considers it a privilege to also be the teacher and mother of an amazing daughter, Ashe. Her work is an exploration of the roles of women of African descent in Black freedom movements. She specifically examines the connections between African military cultures, spirituality, art, and interpersonal relationships as they relate to African liberation struggles. So welcome aboard, Sister Iyelli.
Thanks for having me.
And we may also call you Mrs. Modernity. I don't know if modernity. I don't know how we're branding that at the moment, but yeah, very glad to have you on board. And then to the right of the screen, at the top right there, we have the man like Jared Ball, I Mix What I Like, of I Mix What I Like fame. And Jared Ball is a father and husband. After that, he is a professor. I love how how you guys kind of prioritize the family stuff over the professional stuff. I like that. He is a professor of communication studies at Morgan State University in Baltimore, MD. Is that Maryland? Baltimore,
yes,
Maryland?
Sorry, yes, Maryland, yeah. Yes.
You see, in the UK, when we see all these like initials after town names, it's like, what is that? What's that? I have no idea what that is. So, Baltimore, Maryland. He is the founder and curator of imixwhatilike.org, a multimedia hub of emancipatory journalism and revolutionary beat reporting. Ball is also the author of The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power, which has been published on Palgrave in 2020. Jared, welcome aboard.
It's always a pleasure. Good to be with everybody.
Good. And then bottom right corner, we have my brother, my friend, my comrade here in the UK, Kevin Bismark Cobham. Kevin is a criminal lawyer, has been for many years, and perhaps more importantly, he's a very profound and elaborate and eloquent thinker and speaker on issues pertaining to the African diaspora. Me and him, as I said in our last conversation, we go back many years, particularly our paths crossed when he used to challenge me when I was in the AAPRP, and he would be there challenging us on our scientific socialism and pointing out various areas where we could do with a little bit more little bit more critique and analysis. And yeah, I'm very grateful to have Kevin Bismark Cobham on board here. Welcome aboard, Mr. Kevin.
Greetings, everyone. Glad to be here.
And last, but of course by no means least, although he was leased into the room just before we came online.
Oh, come on, Yeli.
We have Quito Swan. Quito, big up yourself. Now, Quito's been, I've had a conversation with Quito and Jared as well, of course, on Small Acts. Quito Swan is director of the William Monroe Trotter Institute for the Study of Black Culture and professor of Africana Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. He is the historian of, he is a historian, not quite the historian yet, but he's getting there. He is a historian of the African diaspora and a scholar of Black internationalism and global Black power. Swan is the author of Paulu's Diaspora, Black Internationalism and Environmental Justice, University Press of Florida, 2020. Black Power in Bermuda, The Struggle for Decolonization, that's Palgrave Macmillan, 2010. And the forthcoming Pacifica Black, Black Internationalism and Oceania on New York University Press. Quito, welcome aboard, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me, Yeli. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Now, this conversation we're going to be talking about, let me just take the background off 1 second. There we go. Yeah, so we're going to be talking about a series here in the UK, which has just finished, which is called Small Acts. And this is a series produced or directed by Steve McQueen, who of course directed 12 Years a Slave. And really, in the UK, it's caused a lot of conversation, a lot of controversy in the Black community, particularly on online spaces. And we had a conversation with Quito and Jared a couple of weeks ago now on the first installment, which was Mangrove. So today, I think we've all watched all of the episodes. Hopefully,
yeah? I haven't seen the last one, okay. Education.
That's all good. That's enough. So yeah, what I might do? Shall we start by getting everybody's impressions? Maybe if we start by getting people's overall impressions of the series as a whole, that might be a good place to start. And shall we start with Kevin? Do you want to start us on the journey of unpacking packaging?
I thought you might start with me, Yeli, but I'll give you my overall take on the films. Certain words keep on springing up to me when I think about the films. I think about the words ghost stories. I think of the word meta narratives. I try to place myself in these films and ask myself the extent to which, to what extent the lens which is looking back in my history, the African Caribbean histories between the 60s and 80s, to what extent that reflects my recollections, my memories, those around me, those who I lived with. So the overall feeling I had from the films was that we shouldn't be surprised as to the general thrust, the meta-narrative thrust of the films. What do I mean by that? Well, I wrote a post the other day where I reminded people that Steve McQueen is not just Steve McQueen, he is Sir Steve Rodney McQueen, CBE, Commander of the British Empire. He's a Knight of the British Empire. And so one of the things which I found interesting to explore looking at these films was to ask ourselves to what extent somebody who has been so honoured by the British state, by the Queen no less, she's taken her sword and she's tapped it on his shoulder. To what extent can we expect him to present narratives which reflect the consciousness of the Black community, or are we really having to kind of pick bits and pieces from the shadows of the films, the ghost stories, as it were, understanding that if he's going to have 5 films on British state TV at prime time, 9 o'clock on a Sunday evening, then we understand that the meta-narrative thrust of those films are not going to present the what Frank Wilderson or Saidiya Hartman would describe as the unthought. And what do I mean by the unthought? I mean our thoughts, which never or very rarely get that kind of narrative spread, that opportunity for us, even within ourselves, amongst ourselves, in order for us to project our lived experience, our lived realities from the point of view of a Black consciousness. So that's my overall feeling about the films. I'm not somebody who thinks that these films shouldn't be on TV, or we shouldn't have a broad range of perspective over our histories. But the reaction, I've got to mention this, the reaction to the films in the UK has very much reminded me of the reaction I had when I was a child, or my brother had or my sister had. You know, back in the 70s and 80s, when there was hardly any Black faces on UK TV, just 2 channels, or 2.5 channels if you include the BBC Two, which was on half the time. You know, a Black person would come on the TV and it'd be like, wow, Mum, Dad, come quick, there's a Black person on the telly, you know, come and watch. And so even regardless of whether the Black person was good, bad, or indifferent, or painted in the usual stereotype or whatever, we'd all at least be curious as to, no, there's a Black person portrayed on the TV. Much of the reaction to Small Axe, in my humble opinion, is not far removed from that. Much of the discussion. And there's an element within the Black community here in the UK which rather wants people to be kind of grateful. You know, that thing with Black people, we always have to be grateful, and we should be grateful at least that we've got these films screened on primetime TV. So that's my introduction. As you can probably guess, I could rattle on for a bit more, but I'll let other people have more interesting things to say.
Yeah, who wants to jump in? Back of any of that, or to give your thoughts on the series as a whole? The floor is open. Let's go with Jared. I was just about to say.
I was just going to say, I mean, I will. You know, I was actually hoping since we've all gone that Dr. Ichile would jump out there, but I don't know if it was just because I got to the click first, to the mouse first, or. But if you do, Iyelli, I would want to hear from you first before, certainly before I go. But if not, sure. I will jump out there. But yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I don't have a whole lot to say. I'm here to discuss, and I'm really honored to be invited to this dialogue with you all. I'm neither British nor Caribbean, and so I'm in some ways an outsider and observing this set of narratives about, ostensibly about the Black British experience from the outside, so I'm really just more interested in hearing what folks who are within these communities have to say about it. I'm here to learn more than I'm here to offer opinions, but I will say, on some level, I really, in ignorance, enjoyed watching the series, have enjoyed it so far. There are elements about it that I relate to, just as an African person, or perhaps as a human, maybe even to some degree as a woman. I think for those of us outside of the UK or outside of the Caribbean and other parts of the Black world, I think this there could be a worse point of entry into this conversation, into this new knowledge that we don't really have about Black Britain. So I'm constantly in conversations with friends and family about, my family's pretty knowledgeable, but about Black people from the UK, and there's no knowledge. We don't know that they deal with hyper incarceration and police brutality, and we don't understand the migration experience. Like, a lot of us don't have that context. So so I have a friend on Facebook from the UK who was saying that he hated these films. He hated Lovers Rock in particular. And I kind of, this was just last night, and I was trying to get the brother to explain to me why hate was the word. That sounded really heavy. And he kind of first threw out kind of, what if it was Tyler Perry directing a film about Black Baltimore, some very deeply important part of Black Baltimore culture, like and I was like, Steve McQueen and Tyler Perry? I didn't get Tyler Perry vibes from that at all. But again, it's my ignorance. And then I think he switched to Spike Lee. And I'm still more curious about what the criticisms are for my own knowledge and my own, education. And I'm sure we'll get into much more detail about each film, but yeah, that's all I've got. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. And yes, I saw that conversation, and it was the brother. He had a very distinct, a very strong view on which ones were the best films, and in particular, Lovers Rock is one that has really sort of stood out from what I've seen online.
Yeah, he ranked them like in order of best to worst, and he was very clear. I think his critique, though, just to be, fully transparent, was that Steve McQueen had not engaged with people who, like Kevin, who had lived through this time period and had these experiences and could have lent an authenticity to the filmmaking that was not there. Apparently, that was not a part of Steve McQueen's process. So I definitely agree with that. If that's the critique, just completely blindly, I know that's a problem. So. Yeah.
But just real quick, am I hearing that Spike Lee is considered the advanced radical standard in that?
No, I basically challenged him on comparing Steve McQueen to Tyler Perry, and he said, okay, well, I really am just referring to a controversial Black filmmaker. So, like, what about like Spike Lee? Like, maybe that's closer to what I mean. Like, still Black, still controversial, maybe not as obviously off as Tyler Perry.
Yeah, I was gonna say I have a lot of problems with Spike Lee, but he's nowhere near as bad as Tyler Perry. So I just was hoping that. So on the one hand, I hope they're not being conflated, and on the other hand, I hope Spike isn't being lofted as the radical standard. Anyway,
Jared, do you want to go next? Do you want to give us your overall thoughts? There's about 3 different threads that have already been put out there that we're going to come back to.
Mine will be equally short, and I feel very much the same way, albeit even more of an extended, kind of outsider of outsiders of sorts. But at the same time, I feel like what I end up doing all the time, it was done with these series to the extent that I think I saw. I know I cut off Lovers Rock early. I couldn't. I couldn't. But the 2 that were based on historical, or supposed to be based on historical reality, I read that 2 of them were supposed to be, and the one we talked about last time, and then the what I thought was is that the 3rd one with the. Now I can't remember with the brother who's a cop. The police officer. That's the 3rd one, right?
Stormtrooper.
Right. Stormtroopers, exactly, right. But anyway, I'm drawn. Anyway, what I end up doing is I feel drawn in from the outside. That I get. I'm very much. I feel like we're getting exposed to a part of the diaspora experience we don't often get exposed to, for some series of reasons, which I think would be interesting in itself to explore. But then I also start finding the similarities. So one of the things I just started when I was watching the other day, last night or the other, I can't even tell anymore when anything is happening, was that I wrote here that it's still a safe display of Blackness. That again, somewhat similar to what I understood Kevin to be saying. These are products. Whether you look at them as commercial or state products, these are products. And I didn't know the knighthood connection, but I think that makes it even better in terms of making clear what we're dealing with here, whether we look at it as an Amazon product or an international private equity or a state or British state product. I mean, that's, I think, the most valuable way to look at it, even when we feel like moments of enjoyment or pleasure in watching. When I watch the father of the stormtrooper in his anger, even as it's, I think, demeaned, which is consistent with these kinds of films, I love it. And I always think anger is underappreciated and under underappreciated. But at the same time, it's still a safe display of blackness that seems to, and I don't want to say it goes to the extent of some of the films I wrote in my notes here, but that kind of starts to run with the same thing of, yeah, things are bad or were bad, but even within the horrors of this situation, the wonders of an advanced so-called first world state allow for progress. And we can see like the police officer brother goes on to a lifelong career within the police force. And I read somewhere that was described that even though he struggled with it, that there was he really like stuck to what we saw depicted in the series, that he wanted to bring some sort of advanced unity between Black people and the state, and he felt that he had done that. So there's this theme. So like when I think of movies that were produced in this country, in the United States, I think of, like Men of Honor and Jackie Robinson, and even in terms of Jewish history, School Days, that movie with Matt Damon and them back in the day. And in terms of women and feminism, G.I. Jane, we get all these films that, you see someone individually who's supposed to be from the margins overcome white supremacy or the state, or overcome the individual racism of individual members within the state and advance. And somehow it's still supposed to be a feel-good story because by the end they've overcome something. And even today, it's been announced that we get the first nominee of a Native American to the cabinet, and people are saying, like, yay, and like this is great, and see the state even after years of genocide can advance someone. I mean, so that's the kind of feel I was getting. And then the last point, I'll stop here, is that when they mention in brief, I believe his name is Robert Peel. I did just happen to be reading about this guy who is often considered to be the founder of the so-called modern first world police force. And I just want to read this quick half a paragraph from The End of Policing in Alex Vitale's book, which I know is getting a lot of attention over here in some circles. But he just says that anyway, that was at least somewhat of a nod to people who might know, but it's certainly not played up for certain in the series, is most liberal and conservative academics attempt to counter this argument by pointing to the London Metropolitan Police, held up as the quote unquote original police. Original police force, created in 1829 by Sir Robert Peel, from whom the Bobbies get their name. This new force was more effective than the informal and unprofessional watch or the excessively violent and often hated militia and army. But even this noble endeavor had at its core not fighting crime, but the managing disorder and protecting the propertied classes from the rabble. So on the one hand, well, he claims that it's less vicious. I don't know to what extent African people in those communities would feel that way, but that there was at least a verbal nod in the film, and I'm not trying to give him credit for that, or in the series, to this history, but it's almost in a way of I take it as not a nod, but as a needle thrown at those of us who might know some of this history or be aware of some of this history. I don't know. It's sort of like to tease us a little bit, without really going into what it means that the police locally are doing what the military does internationally, as Malcolm X used to say. So anyway, I think that there's a sophisticated game being played where we're ultimately supposed to feel good about the nature of the state, and feel good, as was already said, about seeing some Black stories being told. And even in mid some wonderful performances and some good music as well. But I think ultimately the messaging gets a very pro-state and pro-imperial, we can overcome type of a vibe.
Okay. Wow, good stuff. A lot in there as usual, as ever. Brother Quito, your thoughts, my brother.
Yeah, there is a lot. Well, first, let me say, since my brother Iyelli wanted to call me out, showing up, I was hoping you would have picked me first, because then I would have said something like "last axe fell from first tree" or something like that. Given we're talking about small axe, a big tree, but I'll say it anyway. I'll say it anyway. But for me, I think that I personally have such disdain anyway for, I think, popular media representations, that I mean, similar to what Kevin said, my expectations are so low anyway. I think when it comes to Black people, and for me, it's not even a question of am I grateful for it, but as someone who teaches and lives in diaspora, I'm always looking for what's useful. Like, is there something at least useful I could use
exactly.
in our broader mission? Because that's all I can ask. And you know, some conversations I have had, it's been, you know, did they get some things right? Did they get some things right? And what are the things that he got right? But I love it even for what gets done wrong, because that gives us a chance to do this, right? It gives us a rallying point. It gives us the orientation, and my own positionality is kind of like outside and inside, because classic one example would be the song, you know, Kunta Kinte by the Revolutionaries that he plays, big you know, where folks are going off it in Lovers Rock, and this kind of like therapeutic meditation, ritualized, you know, space that, you know, folks in at the dance. Yeah, there are problematics around it, but I know personally what that song did to young Black people in Bermuda, for example, in our dub sessions when that song will come on. And I know what dub did as a space of consciousness for Black folks, for example. And for me, is this a lived experience? Like, I've seen, you know, Black people in the space, Rasta collectives, you know, dreads, non-dreads, African Center folks. When that song will play in our sessions, folk go off, and not even like over the top like what the film kind of demonstrates, but that space of a collective space that's really reflecting the tensions of Babylon. And that's what I see through all the films. It's Babylon. It's confusion. It's not right. It's tensions. You know, I don't feel like this necessarily, you know, the things got overcome in the end. I just see, for me, it leaves us to where we are. We're still in this state of Babylon. Like, we're still in this broader trap. But I find myself doing things with the film that you know, the director probably didn't anticipate. And so I'm going to have to catch myself, because I know, and it's something that we talked about before, I'm sometimes looking at this film of where it takes us, even if what's not in the film. And so I find myself doing the work of the director that might not have been the director's intention. For example, did he intend to invoke this song that might bring in these diasporic peoples in a radicalized space? Probably not. But yet I find myself saying, hey, that's a space that I can engage. So for me, that's an insider space. It doesn't diminish the problematic. It certainly doesn't diminish the legitimate critiques that will come from Black people in the UK that would know what, you know, that film means within the context. But I found it very useful to engage. And for me, there were things that have been useful, even the problems, you know, abound that I might have with it historically.
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned that dub, because I'm sort of not glad, because I was hoping that no one else would know the name of that film so that I could come on here and say,
gotcha.
That is such a, you know, yeah, it's a big tune. I had that on a cassette tape in the 90s, and I never knew what the name of the song was until about 2 years ago when I found it on YouTube. Interesting that you brought that up, because that scene with the dreads just wiling out basically and losing it and rolling on the floor, and you know, Shaka Ra here has said that the song was appropriate, what was on the screen was inauthentic. And yeah, that's something that's come out in a lot of critiques of the film, is that just would not happen in that kind of dance. But one thing I would say is that I think when that song came on and when the reaction of the crowd came on, that was probably the only time that I felt energy in that film, in Lovers Rock, because a lot of the rest of it was very slow. Like when they did the Silly Games, Janet K Silly Games, and that went on for about 45 minutes, and they were playing it all the way to the end, and then they played it to the end, and then they did a cappella for like a whole nother long drawn out. And I just thought, this would not happen there's no way that you would let a song play that long. You might wheel it back a lot of times, like you know, 5-6 times, a really big current tune in a dance. You might wheel it back a few times, but you wouldn't play it that long. And so for me, the energy was all getting kind of like low. But I would say that when Kunta Kinte came on and the excitement was the first point I felt, oh, this is real excitement. Do you guys think that perhaps there was like, I said to my wife that it's almost like those guys on the floor, it was like, are they trying to give a hint or like an echo of being, you know, what do you call it, when you're ridden by an Orisha, or when you're visited by an Orisha or something? Because that's the vibe that I got, Sister Iyeli.
So again, caveats already out there. I'm an outsider watching this, but I definitely have a certain lens when I watch scenes like that, right? So the way I read it when I watched the scene, and I talked to Quito about this already, but like, I felt like that character, Martha's brother, came into the party as a disruptive energy. He was off anyway. Of course, he's not gonna vibe out to the song the way you would expect him to, because he was a disruptive energy. He was off. He was off. Everyone knew he was off. They gave him his space. They gave him the microphone to try to like assuage him. So yeah, there's the culture, and then there's the character development. There's the character and the energy of that character. He wasn't supposed to be doing what you would expect him to do in that space. He was off. So that's how I read it. And then when he hits the floor and then other people go into this trance, I definitely saw that as manifestation of spirit. I definitely saw that because I've actually seen that now, not in a setting like that per se, but I read that as like a war energy that kind of just spontaneously came up through that one young man because he had something to get out, and he came in this party and it just came out, and sometimes that thing spreads. And so I hear the critique and I respect it, of course, but I think I read it as kind of being intentionally inauthentic or intentionally not on key. But again, check me.
Ellie, can we talk a little bit about inauthenticity and language now? Because and throw out the question as to whether McQueen was also intentionally inauthentic with language. Because what we have seen is that regardless of whether people are more or less favorable to whichever of the films in the series, the 5 films, again and again, people have said, what are they doing with the language? Why are people talking like this? Why are people from one island in the Caribbean speaking with the vernacular of people from another island of the Caribbean? Or people of my generation said, we didn't talk like, you know, what? There was the language, film after film after film, the language was a mess. Now, given the acting talent we have in the UK and beyond, and given the clear artistic and screenwriting talents of those who made the effort to produce these 5 films, why did it not seem to matter the authenticity of speech? Why did that not seem to matter to either the screenwriters or McQueen himself? Was it just enough for these Black people to have sounds coming out of their mouths? And if again and again and again, people who loved the films, didn't like them, indifferent, had various views, almost everyone universally came back and said, yeah, man, but how these guys were speaking, where were they getting that speech from? That again asks us, well, who was the director speaking to? Who was Sir Steve speaking to?
You know, Kevin,
who was he really speaking to?
I actually have a lot of thoughts about that, because that totally drew me as well. And I almost felt as if it seemed like in Lovers Rock, they had supposed to be a younger group. So they went with younger contemporary, I guess, actors, but they totally botched what the soundscape would be of that era. And it's like the next film, which seems to be later, actually was semi closer than what the Lovers Rock was, and it drew me totally. And I felt like, I don't know, was that creative laziness? Was that totally has been a problem that I've talked about that stood out. Also, but I think for the intentionality though, you know, once again, the inside context, like growing up in Bermuda, you know, we all were, you know, in my generation, we're trying to be song boys.
Yeah.
You know, we're trying to start these local sounds, and you know, we're speaking, and not that we're trying to leave our culture as Bermudians, but we're trying to sound like the song boys and the big sound systems that we hear on cassette tapes from Jamaica. So we want to sound like Kilimanjaro, or we want to sound like Saxon. So we're in our little local dance halls, house parties, on the microphones, not professional, trying to be, but you might know the music, so you might play a song that the community gravitates towards. But it's unprofessionalism of the sound system, but it's still a reality that you know. And what I'm saying is the localness. There were professional Bermuda sounds that we were underneath that. We're not even at the professional local sounds. So it's like a hot mess, but it's a localized love of that hot mess. And so I was at one point I said, is McQueen actually trying to have the DJ, you know, the mic toaster capture the stumbling of the local sound? Because if he is, that's genius, because that's what I'm hearing. But if it's not, then it adds to the other issue that you raised of the language and the vernaculars are just totally off.
I mean, my honest view is that McQueen simply didn't care. It just wasn't important enough for him to make the effort with regards to the authenticity of the language. Ellie, can I make another point about language with regards to the Mangrove film? Because one of the things which somebody has raised, a lawyer friend actually has raised about the Mangrove film, is the discursive field of language within the courtroom. Now, putting aside whether we can ever, as Black people, achieve that human coordinate of justice in this world, what was interesting is that in that film Mangrove, when it came to the trial, of the 9 defendants, 2 represented themselves, and then eventually a third person represented themselves. And if we look back on that, not so much the film, I mean the film portrayed that, but just the reality of that. What you had was 2 of the defendants able to introduce to some extent the grammar of suffering of Black people, which the language of a courtroom simply does not allow. The language of the courtroom means that you have to speak for your barrister or your solicitor or your solicitor advocate. You have to speak through them. And we all have to try and basically be upper middle class white people. We have to talk, like upper middle class white males when we are advocates in court. Women have to deepen their voices. West Africans or Caribbean people or South Asians have to anglicize their voices. And we all basically have to talk as if we've spent 12 years in a public school. Now, and not only how we talk, but the tonalities, the rhythm of the courtroom, the way we present. I'll give you one little example. If you're in a courtroom and you're standing in front of a judge and you want to say to the judge that you need to speak to your client who's standing behind you, you'll say something along the lines of, "My honor, might I turn my back?" Because that's what you say in an English courtroom. "My honor, your honor, might I turn my back? Your honor, might I turn my back?" You wouldn't say, "Can I just turn around? I need to have a word with my client." Now, and what was interesting in the film Mangrove was that Darcus Howe and LeConte, the other person who represented herself, is they were able to introduce into the courtroom the grammar of suffering of poor housing, the grammar of suffering of unemployment, the grammar of suffering of police brutality, the grammar of suffering of the fact that the Mangrove was a community space of resistance, and just of renewal. Christina Sharp talks about us living in the wake of chattel slavery, the afterlife of slavery, living in the wake of that. But also she talks about having these little spaces, these little ecologies within that atmosphere, within the weather, where we can kind of have our own space to at least form kind of little ecologies of resistance. And what you saw in terms of the language of the courtroom was 2 people able to get across to the jury a Black grammar of suffering, which ordinarily in a courtroom you never get remotely close to. If you try to go there, it's not relevant because the rules of advocacy determine what's spoken and what's not.
What do you mean by grammar of suffering?
Okay, what I mean by grammar of suffering is the fact that we are we use concepts and we use terms and phrases to describe ourselves in this world, which are borrowed concepts. We also use borrowed institutionalities. So for example, sticking to the Mangrove film, we'll talk about justice, and we know that justice in a court of law for a black person, if you win the case or if you don't get acquitted, gives you a period of relief, but it doesn't really talk about our suffering. That word justice, that the use of that grammar, it doesn't really get at our suffering. We were in a paradigmatic space of suffering before we ever got to the courtroom. One could argue as soon as we get out of the womb. One could argue as soon as we go to school and find from the age of 4, 5, 6 that the white kids are being treated different than us. You experienced it, Ellie. I experienced it. So how do we make films, make art, make music, which speaks to that grammar, that reality? So when I'm talking about the grammar of suffering, justice, humanity, all of these human coordinate type terms, which we cling to, because if we cling to them, then we believe we get some kind of recognition, right? And society, wider white society or civil society will listen to us. But they don't. They don't listen to us. So, for example, at the time of Mangrove in 1970, the black community was up in arms because of the sus laws, the use of the Vagrancy Acts, the use of the 1824 Vagrancy Act to stop, harass, beat up, specifically young black men. So we campaigned, didn't we? We campaigned. Or our parents campaigned, our uncles, our aunts, our mothers, our grandmothers campaigned. And we got the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. From that slave positionality, that blackened positionality, we pleaded for another form of justice. But yet, if we look at 2020 United Kingdom in London, you and I are 19 times more likely to get stopped and searched. If we're a young black man, I'm not a young black man, but if you are a young black man, you're 19 more times to get stopped and searched in London than if you were a young white man. So law, legality, rights, justice, these terms are not terms which we can fully embrace. And this is what basically McQueen is trying to make out that we can. McQueen is trying to make out that we can live within this paradigm and there can be some positive, redemptive future. And he puts a capital P in front of the word progress. But the reality is that the grammar of suffering that we need to explore has to break through these epistemes, has to break through these limitations of thought, conceptualizations. So that's what I took from Mangrove, not so much the film, because it's a dramatization, but the fact that the reality was there were 2 of those defendants, eventually 3, who said, you know what, I'm not going to speak through a lawyer. I'm not going to have my voice channeled through those legal niceties, those legal terms. I'm going to speak for myself. The judge might try and cut me down, and the judge did try to limit what they could say, but enough of that voice came out, which reflected the true grammar of suffering of black people.
Can I just wanted to say that very quickly, that while I think it sounds to me like I tend to agree or feel most the sentiment so far from Kevin, I just wanted to add that this is sort of what I mean when I'm talking about, similar to what he has said about the function or purpose of these products. That so I agree certainly that we in collectives like this can make some sort of use of it. I think we're making some use of it here. But it's sort of the ability of these products to set the context for these discussions that I think is sort of the power that they play. and the ranges that they limit. So for instance, we're not talking about this in the context of what I would have to imagine are far more than I'm aware of, certainly, stories of more radical responses to these very realities that African people in that part of the world face. So similar to what happens here, we will get stories of sort of varying redemptive degrees in terms of this state. But we rarely hear of the most radical forms. So I was trying to think in terms of popular media, what of any Black radicalism I've heard coming out of that part of the world. And the only one I could think of was a caricature of a brother named Michael X in that movie with Jason Statham about a bank robbery that was supposed to be based in some form of reality. But again, even that's much like the caricatures I see of Black radicalism coming out of this part of the world. So that's sort of the part of it. And then there is one part that I wanted that sort of was touching to home a little bit that I saw in terms of a similarity, in part because a very good friend of mine from college is in coming sort of to the end of a career similar to this brother working within the police, where for very similar reasons, you know, a lot of Black people join the police because they have witnessed or suffered firsthand family violence at the hand of the police, and their particular response is which I may struggle with, but seems to permeate, is I will get in and I'll change it and I'll make change. And this brother that I'm thinking of is basically coming to the tail end of his career of a story that I know Hollywood would never tell, because it doesn't have, even to the extent that we may disagree, the McQueen-esque again redemptive quality or possibility in that story, in terms of the idea that you can go into these institutions and change them. That's not what happens. Something very much different happens mostly to those people who try to do that, unless they acquiesce and become something that is unrecognizable to the communities that they left, which is, I think, why anyway. But the last thing I just want to leave with is at least stop here with is a question about the music. I heard a lot, particularly in this last one that I was watching. I guess that's episode 3. Or was it the last 2 even? Anyway, I heard a lot of Black American pop music. And I was just curious to what extent that popular music was popular in Black communities in that part of the world. I mean, is it legit that the father and son would have been riding off to Al Green as he's going to drop him at the police station? I don't know. I was just curious. I found that, you know, like we heard White Lines. I was like rocking out to White Lines in the joint. I was like, was that song? I know hip hop spread and was everywhere, but was that song really? Would that have been on to the extent that we were hearing it in these series?
For my, I think so. I think with
go on,
with the UK, with you know, up until this century, I'd say up until the 2000s, the music that we've consumed has come from overseas, and the music that we've consumed has come from either the Caribbean, Jamaica, really, reggae, or from the US, and that has been R&B, and that certainly has been hip hop as well. So I'd say, I mean, I was too young to know that the 80s, but yeah, you would hear that. You would hear. My brother used to have all sorts of like electro. There was like these compilation albums you could have, Electro 1, Electro 2, you know, all these mixes and stuff. And you know, we were listening to Luther and Alexander O'Neill and, you know, Sherelle and all these people. You know, yeah, we're basically. And this is the funny thing, that when Iyelli, I think you were saying that, or maybe Jared was saying that, you know, we don't hear anything about Britain hardly. You know, Black Britain. In my head, I'm thinking, well, we're probably, this country would be a state, you know, it would be a big state in the United States. The UK would be a fairly big state, a California type state, but the Black community in this country is only 2 to 3 million of us. So we'd be like a minuscule Black population if we were in the United States. We wouldn't be a very significant Black population here.
So can I correct you on that? can I correct you on that? Less. When that 2-3 million is the non-white population. Actual African and black, we're talking about around 1 million, 1.5 million max.
So we're a very, very small community, and so we have for a long time, up till, I would personally say, up till grime, the rise of grime, we've just been mainly consuming music from overseas. So yes, Jared, I would say that, yeah, that was quite realistic that you'd be hearing all of those songs in those days. I just wanted to ask, so you mentioned there the idea of just getting into the system and fixing the system. I think one of the purposes that this series has played is that I would say, so if I'm thinking, okay, what's the point of this series? Why was this commissioned and why has it been launched now? I think it's been commissioned and launched now in order to buy off people like me and Kevin, in order to buy off black middle-class people in the UK, in order to say, guys, it's all right. I know Black Lives Matter, this is terrible, this is really bad. But guys, don't worry, because now look, we've got TV. You know, it's like Kevin was saying, there's black people on TV. You know, there's black people on TV, and not only black people on TV, but there are. I said it in our last conversation. Mangrove was basically, look, the problem is just that Frank Critchlow is not able to run his business in peace because of these horrible policemen. But court case will sort that out, and then he can, you know, hopefully run his. You know, we can run our businesses in peace. Red, white, and blue. The problem is just that these bloody policemen are just a bit racist. They're a bit ignorant and backwards. All you need is a few more black people to get into the police, and then that will basically resolve it, and they'll be fine. I think the narratives in a lot of these, I think the solutions in a lot of these films speak to a lot of us black middle class people who have that kind of black capitalist mentality, where we do actually think that the solution to our problems is to have more black businesses, is to have more black people in positions of power, and so on. Keto, do you want to go? Can
I just say, I'm sorry to interrupt. There was one thing I just wanted to say, I forgot, just very quickly. When you all were talking about the language and the accents, I just want to say, you know, Hollywood, of course they're not going to care, and they don't care about the specifics, because even in the white European context, they don't even care. That's why, you know, you have Mel Gibson playing, you know, a Scots without barely an accent. You know, Kevin Costner's, you know, doesn't even, I mean, some of them, they don't even try. They're showing up all over the world, and they're Matt Damon is in ancient China just talking like, you know, like he's in Boston. I mean, they don't even try, you know what I'm saying? So
and they mess up black regionalism here too, and black intergenerational accents here too. We're not good at sounding like our foreparents. We're not good at sounding like we're from Louisiana, which is very distinct. We're not good at sounding like we're from New York. No one gets it right. I mean, honestly.
And that's something a lot of people have talked about, is that generational thing. But yeah.
No, but I think, and this is why I think the conversation matters around diaspora conversations, right? We have to have these conversations, because while you're seeing, you know, the world from a Black UK perspective, as Jared mentioned, you know, the narrative, the popular narrative of the Black British experience is that there is no radical tradition in Britain, and just the sound of the Black British accent doesn't invoke radicalism. That's the broader master narrative that's being told to the rest of the Black world. That, you know, Black people of Britain are close to empire, speak the Queen's English, you know, and the real revolutionary resides somewhere else in terms of Black people. So engaging the film from that perspective as a Black person who actually thinks totally opposite of that and says we have Black radical traditions across the world. It's hard not to say, wow, okay, they mentioned the Panthers several times. It's not that it's not problematic, but this is my point about, it's a reminder of that we are in Babylon. This is Babylon. It's going to have tension, right? It's going to be confusion. It's going to be messy. It's going to be problematic, because is that not the state of the Black world? Like what would be perfect, right? Like, you don't get blacker than being in an imperfect world of Black misrepresentations. Like that is as perfect as you can get being a Black person in this world. I mean, and so, but back to the soundscape, Jared, and the generation piece is not simply, for me, it's not even, it's what's heard, but it's the response of the generation to the music that's heard. Like, how would his father feel about Al Green as opposed to him? Like, that's the other inside nuance piece. But for me, you know, I think he's also he's clearly trying to use the music to mark time. So in education, Abyssinians, that's, you know, the song Start to Masagana, that's 1976. That's a big tune. Once again, that's the song, right? And maybe that's for folks like me. Maybe that's to buy me out. You know what I mean? Buy him out. Buy folks like him who want to hear this soundtrack, because both Abyssinians and Kunta Kinte are songs that I meditate to. Like, that's in my consistent rotation. But I heard Dennis Brown, Black Uhuru, Augustus Pablo, the scene of Cotton Records, John Hout, Ika Mouse. It's like from another different perspective, we're taught that the dancehall doesn't even matter for Black people in terms of a place of intellectual thought, a spirituality. We shouldn't even be thinking about it. You know, Rasta's just some crazy aberration of Black folks. Why should we even engage these deeper discourses? And so for me, it's like looking at what's useful. And going back, for me, Iyelli, the brother who walks in the dance, that's Ilegba to me. I see Ilegba. Like, Ilegba shows up, and it's just, you got to figure out how to handle this dude.
Yeah.
In a context, and I think another running theme is the question of mental health. That, but borderline mentally, it's like that's the Black world. It's like this borderline theme. But how have our communities dealt with mental health in a non-state sponsored, non-state medicated context? And once again, maybe I'm not doing what McQueen is doing. I'm taking McQueen and maybe I'm going somewhere else that maybe he's not even conceptualizing. But in Bermuda, there's a list of folks, and other Black communities have this, of folks who were known to have mental health issues or challenges that were actually part of the community. We had a guy named Scuffler, and Scuffler, I'm laughing because Scuffler had clearly mental health challenges, and he would show up at our public school, and then someone would say, "Scuffler, sir," and everybody would like, "Oh no, here comes Scuffler." Scuffler might walk into your classroom, and there'd be a Black woman teacher be like, "Hey, Scuffler, how you doing? Look, let's go for a walk," and take Scuffler out, and he would leave. Like, he wasn't a physical threat, but Scuffler always knew where the next party was, the latest dances. He got into the dances for free. Nobody charged him. Sometimes he'd get in the microphone, and obviously, I'm not saying this is what McQueen did, but it was a reminder of me of how the dance or spaces like music have served like therapy and some form of church. Because at the end of the day, she wakes up a few minutes later, is to go to church. I think McQueen would be intentional about that and saying that, but these young Black folks already had church on Saturday night. Like, the space that has been outlawed by the society. Well, I don't know if I'm saying this, right? But the space that's been outlawed by, I'm saying this, the space that's been outlawed by the society, that the police surveil and say, you got to shut down your dons at 1 o'clock, right? But white folks could party 3 in the morning. The space where you might have political discourses about Rasta and Pan-Africanism and Black power, but as a young person, you're still exploring your sexuality. Can that be a space? Is that a space of reality and transformation for Black people across the world? Have we cultivated those kind of spaces? Are those kind of spaces important to look at? And I would say yes. You know, for someone who sees dancehall not as a total antithesis of Black intellectual radical thought, that sees the dub plates and sound systems as a way of us mapping a Black world, is useful to me. But that doesn't mean there aren't problems. Like, I think that's where we are as Black people. Like, this existence is totally problematic. And Jared, to your point, you know, we can't talk about the integration of Black police officers in the force without talking about how that helps facilitate a surveillance structure and the creation of informants who would spy on Black political movement. We can't discount. It's not just, you know, some, like how his friend, his personal rise to the top. It's like they're building an active infrastructure of Black and brown officers to surveil Black people. Like, that's
but that's your read.
That's the problem. Yes, that's my read. Yes, that's my read.
But that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. I don't think that's what we're supposed to get from the series.
Right.
So you're adding your genius to it, and we love it. But I don't think that's what they were trying to say. Yeah, anyway, but I just want to quickly say, I love your point about how we're all individually targeted for what buys us out. when I heard white lines, I thought they were trying to grab me and say, I see you trying to run, brother. You can't get too far.
Wow. No doubt.
Yeah, they got me too. They almost had me because there were things I really enjoyed about Lovers Rock, to the point that was being made about the music trajectories, particularly the influence of Black American music. We didn't talk about doo-wop and its influence on reggae music. I heard Lonely Girl at that party, which is a doo-wop song that was translated into dub music, right? So like that's an early influence, right? My mom married a Jamaican in the 70s, okay? And when my mom watched that episode and seeing my mom go off into La La Land, who's from a different generation now, you know, there was something to it that really, you know, and just seeing like that one montage of like Black women's arms and hips being kind of softly kind of like touched, like, again, as a despite the fact that later on we get a scene of, you know, intended sexual violence that must be acknowledged, but like softness and being treated softly, and a Black woman saying no, and that being respected in a space, you don't get that in a Tyler Perry film. I'm pushing back on the Tyler Perry comparison, okay? Like the intra-Black violence was not there. A Tyler Perry film where someone's talking about, I'm gonna whoop your ass every 5 minutes to another Black person, or Rosa Parks just sat her ass down, like to reduce our history, not even our radical Black history, but our neoliberal Black history to like Rosa Parks just sat her ass down. Like that's not what I see here. I'm not defending Steve McQueen, but there's a big difference between Tyler Perry and the fact that these people actually mention radical people and actually have them as characters. We're not there yet in from over here. We're not there. Whether we're telling the full story of these people or giving their full measure of history, there's something to be said to the fact that they're there. Obviously, people here in this chat are really knowledgeable about these individuals, but you know, the fact remains there was a still shot of a Paul Bogle photo in the, you know. So I would say my critique maybe is that there is a nod to Black radicalism, but it's silenced. You know, it doesn't go as far. I even still see in this conversation the fact that there's almost like it's the question of marronage. It's the question of opting out completely that is blocked and silenced in this film. And I don't even see a lot of that in this chat, which is outside of the court system, outside of this, you know, mass media system. Instead of kind of, it's almost like this desire for acceptance that we just can't let go of. This desire for inclusion, we want it to be right. Instead of saying like, nah, like, let's drop these expectations. This is not for us. What do we talk about outside of this, right? I feel you. The tropes are there. Every other Black person smoking weed, for instance, while they do everything, you know, we have those same issues over here. But, you know, right, the CLR James, like it comes up as a book recommendation. And he's a character briefly in Mangrove, but like they don't even really tell you who he is or why he's important, you know? So I hear you, but you know, when we see radical figures in film, they are literally the butt of the joke over here. And that's not what I gathered from watching this. So I'm just gonna say that. And Jared, me and you still have to work on that project regarding the Black radical character in American popular media as like a caricature.
Absolutely, because the one pushback that someone could raise, I wouldn't, would be that Huey Newton made it into Black Panther in terms of being pictured on a wall, but I wouldn't. Anyway.
Can I make a point?
Kevin, yeah, you've been, yeah.
Thank you.
So many things, by the way, been brought up. It's just very powerful stuff.
I forget the name of the Leroy Logan film, but the film about the police officer, Leroy Logan.
Red, White, and Blue.
Red, White, and Blue. One of the things which I found particularly troubling was what that film was saying about the Black community's view of the police. Because ultimately it was portraying Logan in a sort of heroic manner, almost as if he had left the sort of backward kind of father, or the backward kind of black community in general, who still had this Dati Babylon kind of view of the police. And he had kind of matured. He had kind of recognized the need for black people to be part of the slave patrol. And so what was interesting about that film is the kind of his kind of transcendence was ultimately based on pushing down the black community and saying, reminding actually white civil society how backward really in so many of the attitudes and values that we all should universally hold. How backward are these black people? Because of course we need police, and of course we need to have black faces in high places within the police force. And in that film, it was very, very, very clear to me that ultimately what Steve McQueen was saying is, now come on, black people, don't be so backward. Don't be so backward. Of course we need black police officers. And of course we need to recognize how this man has struggled. I mean, poor him. Surprise, surprise. He has racist colleagues. Surprise, surprise. They don't come to his help when he's one-on-one dealing with a white thug in one scene. He's left to be on his own. And we're supposed to have some kind of sympathy for him. Not just sympathy for him, but we're also supposed to turn to ourselves as the black community and say, come on now, the right thing is to support this brother. We need to get behind these brothers. I've seen in some of the commentary in social media and elsewhere in the UK now, people saying, when they're talking about red, white and blue, people saying, I used to be one of those guys who used to look at a black police officer and say under my breath, Dati Babylon. And they talk about, they say, I used to be one of those guys, as if now they've made progress and they would no longer say that. As if having made progress and no longer saying that, they are in some sort of a better human being than they were back in the day, when they would had the rightful suspicion based on 500 years of policing that we ought to keep a firm eye on the consequences of the actions of the police in terms of their surveillance on us and the violence which they produce. So that was one thing about that film. The other thing about his films in general, Ellie, is and you asked me about the grammar of suffering, is that we have to talk about what Afro-pessimists refer to as the libidinal economy, even. Yeah. And what do we mean by that? We mean that whole sort of economy of feelings, fears, anxieties, emotions, tensions, prejudices, which exert themselves as soon as the black person appears into space. Look, a Negro, and that happens all the time in every context within civil society. We know it amongst ourselves. Now, how can we produce film? How can we make art, film, music, whatever, which actually allows us to interrogate the way in which we ourselves internalize aspects of that libidinal economy and police ourselves, hold ourselves back. Sometimes we hold ourselves back because we know the consequences of releasing our coerced voice is violence. In all sorts of ways, whether it's violence in terms of losing your job, whatever. But we didn't get that from Steve McQueen's films. That's not what Steve McQueen's films are about. And we have to remind ourselves that his community raised Steve. White civil society knighted him Sir Steve Rodney McQueen, Commander Knight of the British Empire. And when you're a Commander Knight of the British Empire, you're entrusted to defend Imperial Man, and we shouldn't get away from it. You're entrusted to defend it, and you'll do it in your works. And so we have.
Hey, say the title out again, man. Read his title out again in full.
Well, you know what? I've been going on. I should probably not even mention his middle name because mine's Bismark, so I'm not going to shout about that. But his full name is Sir Steve Rodney McQueen, CBE. And CBE stands for Commander of the British Empire. And he gets given a medal. And on that medal, if you look up CBE medal, on that medal, it says something like "For God and Empire." Yeah, and he would have been given that by the Queen. And if you're a Sir, you are a knight. You are a knight of the realm. And so, you know, back in the day, we had a knight in shining armor, and now we have a knight with shining celluloid, shining film. But that's his weapon. Back in the day, the weapon was the sword, and today the weapon which defends the empire is his filmic product. And if we understand that, that's what a knight does. A knight defends the realm. We can recognize that his work is never going to be something that's going to be defending Black people. Well,
there's a lot. This is phenomenal. I would say for me, you know, there's a tradition of the British Empire offering knighthoods, you know, to Black people, quote unquote, in the quote unquote Commonwealth, former colonies, former slave societies. And there's a tradition of that. Where you had, you know, you might have had folks who were revolutionary, who were clearly about African people, similar to what you mentioned, about, you know, I might not have said Dr. Babylon back in the day. I mean, I might have said it back in the day, but I won't say it now, Kevin. You know, it's been the same language around, I wouldn't have accepted this award back in the day.
Yeah.
But I accept it now. Like, there's been also that tradition of certain, you know, Black revolutionaries who now have been, you know, done a lot of service, right, to these former colonies, who now the empire bestows these knighthoods. For me, the issue is not the bestowing of the knighthoods. Like, that's part of the process of buying out the traditions. The question is the acceptance of it. You know, it's not like the bestowing. You would expect it. That's one of the clear shots. That's where you actually really put your politics on the line, you know, and where you stand and what you choose to represent. But I think for me, you know, education is an interesting film. It's interesting because on the one hand, it straddles this. I know Jared's gonna say already. It straddles this question of mental health, and you know, there's a Black youth who, right, is quote unquote is either failed by the system or is in a system that's designed to make us fail. So the system's doing its part, right? It's identifying Black people as being not smart, dumb, can't read. Let's put them in the special schools. Yeah. On a personal level, right? I had a cousin who was diagnosed as being dyslexic. He just couldn't see words, but if you gave this dude numbers, he just shouted on the place, like, you know, engineer, science, physics. He was a genius. So, but you know, school is not being diagnosed as that. He had to struggle for his genes to be represented. But I also thought through of a revolutionary from Bermuda named Buck Burroughs, who I write about, who assassinates the British governor, his bodyguard, and his dog, and the police commissioner, the British police commissioner, I might add. Months before that,
I just love that we were reminded of the dog gets it too. Everybody got to get it. If you defend it down to the hamster and the gerbil and the goldfish gets flushed too. Everybody got to get
it. It was making a lot of noise, and it was a Great Dane. So that's the. But the point is, Buck Burroughs was also in a system of foster care. Didn't know his parents, or didn't have a relationship with his parents, who becomes a juvenile delinquent, ends up incarcerated, meets members of a group called the Blackberry Cadre. They present him with Frantz Fanon. He decides to use his skills for the community. He becomes his revolutionary. His story is not told, mind you, but the overlaps of it is education. For me, that took me somewhere, right? So I know Jared's gonna say, well, that's not the Queen. Absolutely right. But where it also took me was Grenada. And I feel like it's highlighting the group, the South East London Parents Organization, which was a group of Afro-Caribbean parents who knew the system, what the system was doing to Black kids. It comes out of the Black Power movement. They create these Saturday schools. And so I feel like the film is invoking that very real entity that's connected with Black Power, but they also mention a very real book written by Grenadian Bernard Court, who, you know, denounces these practices. But Bernard Court also joins the New Jewel movement. He's a member of the New Jewel movement of Maurice Bishop in Grenada. So he joins his revolutionary group that is significant in Grenadian Caribbean history. But at the same time, 3 years in that revolution, Court is charged for Maurice Bishop's death and assassination and capture. Like he calls his arrest. So in the end of the day, Court shows up as this betrayer of the Grenadian Revolution. The film mentions him at a moment where his book on psychology is important. He started at Brandeis, I think at Sussex University. So he's very accomplished in the field, I guess, of Black sociology. But at the end of the day, he's this enemy of the Grenadian Revolution. So the film doesn't give us any sense of where this is going. But if you're going to mention Grenada and Court and not have some play on Maurice Bishop also is a lawyer who is actively defending other Black people or the Black Power movement charged with crimes in London. He's this critical lawyer in the moment. Like Bishop is in the moment. So I'm asking McQueen to do things that I would like to have been done? Absolutely, yes, I am, right? And I'm imagining, but I think that's also the part of when we do this work, is imagining what could have happened, you know, and where it could have taken us. And there were these for me, that was there were tremendous blind spots and possibilities where education could have taken us. Where it didn't.
I think on that point, over the course of the whole of the 5 films, I agree 100%, Quito. What was lacking was that connection between the Caribbean and the UK Caribbean population, and the way in which there was constant dialogue about what was happening, the current events in the Caribbean, in the UK as well. It wasn't as if we were isolated on our. I remember vividly the impact of United States invading Grenada in '83, and feeling. My father's Jamaica. My father's from Barbados. My mother's from Jamaica. My family is not from Grenada, but we are Caribbean people. We are Black people. We are Africans from the Caribbean. And there was this constant flow of thought, ideas, communication, travel visits. None of that really came out in any of Steve McQueen's films. But I've already told you as to why I think that's the case.
And you know what? What was I going to say? First of all, I was just going to say, everyone on the stream, please make sure you like the video. Thank you to Blood Honey for pointing that out. It helps. If you like the video, it helps to get the video to people's feeds and stuff, because YouTube basically says, oh, this is a popular video. And they'll make sure they push it out to, to subscribers and so forth. So please make sure you like it. Shout out to Blood Honey on that one. And yeah, so I think Quito, every time you mention these points about, because I love the way that you approach these films in this series. I love the way you're approaching it as kind of, it's some raw materials that we should use to jump off and fill in the gaps and make those connections and so on and so forth. So I love that. And one thing I keep thinking is that, if we could take some of those films, splice them up, add in footage from other sources, and make documentary films or wider films that could be really, really powerful, and the big hindrance to that isn't technology per se. The hindrance to that is intellectual property laws, and this is one of the things that, so I'm a Star Wars fan, as you can, probably see from this cup that I keep swigging from every now and again. And in the Star Wars world, Star Wars fanboys, there's a lot of fan fiction. So that's where these fans, they make up their own films basically, and often they'll use footage from the existing films and splice in their own footage that they'll make. But that's really hard to do, because Star Wars can say, look, we've copyrighted that Stormtroopers, as you mentioned, Stormtroopers. We've copyrighted that. We've copyrighted this design. You can't use that word, and frankly, you can't even use any footage from the film. So for me, intellectual property is just such a hindrance to our ability to expand and to create our own, products out of the products that are being served to us. Imagine these products. Small Axe is about our people, our culture, and yet it's been, it's been enclosed you know, our commons has been enclosed by the BBC or by Amazon to the point where, you know, the only footage that we have of some of these, you know, mangrove and so forth is in that film, really, you know, but we can't deal with it. We can't do anything with it apart from accept it in the form that the BBC has presented it to us. You know,
can I challenge you, Ellie, as to whether that whether the mangrove film or any of the films are commons? Because if we think of the commons, if we go back to the enclosure movement in the late 18th, early 19th century in the United Kingdom, what happened was extraction. What happened was extraction. Now and something else was made of what was the commons. If we go back to Zakiya Iman Jackson's concept, which we discussed a while back, Jackson talks about the way in which Black people, how we are everything and nothing at the same time. Our humanity is plasticized. Our humanity can be you know, world heavyweight boxing champion or the greatest soul singer in the world, or it can be the most debased and bestialized aspect of humanity imaginable. But whatever our dehumanized form is, that is used, extracted to allow the real humans to continue to be the real humans at our expense. So when we look at these films and think, oh well, we can't access our commons because it's cordoned off, for want of a better term, it's cordoned off by intellectual property rights and copyright law. We've also got to kind of, I mean, there's an element of truth in that. I'm not saying it's not true, but it's also probably truer to argue that the reality is that we, knowing that we're not going to volunteer ourselves to go into the enclosure, right? Unless we want to be part of the stewardship of the enclosure, part of the slave patrol, or one of the knights of the realm who's going to defend the enclosure. So if we understand the positionality of Blackness from that point of view, we shouldn't worry too much about that being our commons, because we have the capacity within ourselves outside of those structures. The more we delve into darkness, the more we delve into Blackness. We have the capacity outside of those structures, and I would argue it's imperative that we remain, our essence remains outside of those structures if we are really to be able to tell our true stories, in my view.
I'm really happy you said that, Kevin. Thank you for that. I feel like we're still having a really polite, law-abiding conversation sometimes, and I'm like, where is the maroon spirit amongst us? Like, why do we feel like we still have to follow these rules? Like our maroon ancestors, and I'm not trying to get people in trouble in this very public forum, but you know, like, and as a teacher, and I think this is where I started the conversation, and that just to echo something that I heard Quito say, which is like, as a teacher, I watch these films and these television shows, and I'm like, what can I use? I don't show films to my students wholesale and say, this is it. It's great. Just enjoy it. If there's a scene that has value, I'm going to take that scene, use it for what I need to use it for in the classroom, allow them to pick it apart, guide them towards a certain set of learning objectives that I have for my class. And I'll go to the archives if I need to, and I'll take that stuff if I need to. And that's what our maroon ancestors did. If they went to raid a plantation, they went and took the tools or the seeds or whatever it is they needed and took it back to, exactly, it's all colonial. We're still speaking within this context. And I'm like, take what you need, and leave the bones. You know what I mean? Take the meat, leave the bones. Like, we don't have to really, reproduce these structures that kind of limit. It's particularly when we're thinking about intellectual property that ultimately really does belong to us. And I'm just saying that teaching space it can be such a liberating space. Educational space can be such a liberating space to be in, and I think we really need to think about being off the res, so as they say, right? And how we teach, and appropriate whatever it is we need to appropriate. One of my favorite things about the Lovers Rock installment in this series is the irrelevance of white people in that episode. But they weren't. There was like the one crew of white boys and the white manager at the end. outside of that, this was a Black world where white folks we weren't thinking about them. We weren't worried about them. That's a lot. That's a lot. That's a useful idea. And at the same time, I feel like white institutions are all up and through this conversation. Obviously, we need to critique them, but also we really need to talk about how we exist outside of them. So again, thank you, Kevin. How do we function and move ahead outside of these structures instead of worrying about like what kind of movies they're going to allow us to make, what kind of movies connect us with the state? Okay, well, if that's not what we want, then we've got to speak outside of BBC. We've got to talk about what we do outside of these structures and outside of this set of producers and outside of all these Black Knights. What are we doing outside of that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm speaking as a YouTuber. You know, all I know is YouTube, and I just know that if I was to even, I mean, I did a review of one of these. No, I did a video, and I played some footage with no sound from a BBC documentary, and that got the video, you know, marked as, oh no, you know, copyright. So I just know that this world that I know on this platform, on this corporate platform that me and Jared, you know, and you actually are on, is such that they have the power to just, you know, remove it. But you're right. This platform cannot be the platform on which we, you know, plan and execute our liberation, because it's just, you know, for that precise reason that it's theirs and they can control what sort of happens on it. So yeah, you know, you're
YouTube
right.
Is another entry point. You know, it's an entry point. We're having this dialogue. I think it's useful. But again, how do we move then to the next stage of it all, which is off YouTube, away from, you know, outside of that?
But I think for me, and this is why the education piece is interesting, because that's what these Black parents are trying to do with these Saturday schools. So there's a scene where, you know, the mother's finally convinced to take her son, you know, to the Saturday school. And the sister, who is like doing great, the sister wants to be, you know, a fashion designer, you know, she's about it, you know, got her grades together. And she takes her, you know, brother to the door, and you know, the sisters can teach the class, says, you should come inside too. She's like, I don't need to come, I know how to read, kind of thing. So the sister says, well, do you know who Claudia Jones was?
Yeah.
And she doesn't know Claudia Jones. So I know blood hunters can probably say, you know, if you can mention Claudia Jones, you need to mention Amy Ashwood Garvey, right? Other folks, right? I know that. We got that last time. Respect for that.
Yeah.
But I felt like that was an interesting moment. And inside they started talking about African civilization. They're reading books about Africa. So the nerd was, this is what these Saturday schools, and this is what Black Power was doing across the world. You know, most Black Power groups across the Black world create these alternative school structures because they realize the school systems are designed to destroy Black minds. That's a broader tradition. And I would think through folks like Winston True, who was a member of FASIMBAS, which was the youth wing of the SELPO, who actually ends up incarcerated due to his activism. So there are some real live persons who went through those school systems, in other words, that we could engage, right? They're not, you know, those folks are still around, and we could speak to that, you know, in terms of other former political prisoners. My first book on Black Power in Bermuda, I interviewed, you know, folks who went to those schools, the sisters who ran those schools, and they were, as to Iyele's point, they were trying to create these worlds. You know, according to the state, right? Mary no longer had a lamb; she had an M1 gun, right? But besides that, you know, Mary also came from Africa too. So they were like, I think it's really important to just stress the point that we try to create these maroon spaces of where we're trying to, you know, beyond intellectual, trying to create these actual physical spaces. That's part of our charge, in my opinion.
Brother Iyelli and Brother Shakara made a good point there. I don't know if you saw that in the
yeah. I've been trying to get to it for like 15 minutes, but you guys keep bringing up all sorts of interesting stuff.
No, but that is SELPO. SELPO is Southeast London Parents Organization. It's an offshoot of the Black Power movement. It's formed by Afro-Caribbean parents who clearly have a Pan-African mentality. Without question, it's a Pan-Africanist space, right? African, Caribbean, or diversity, African diversity groups that come out of Black Power. There's just another Black Power group like Jared mentioned, Michael X. You know, he founds Ross. I love the name, and he shows up in that film. But these are SELPO. What SELPO does with the liberation schools is, I think, was really transformative, and the kind of thing that, you know, the Black experience in Britain has to offer to the Black world of what Black Power organizations were trying to do. And that, even though it's a short snippet, I think that's an important interjection for me.
And just to build on that point, and also the point that Brother Shakara made and you posted, Ellie, was the fact that if we look at all of these 5 films in their entirety, what they are not is Pan-African. Whatever else they might be, whatever we can take from them, a scene here, a reality there, etc., what they are specifically not is Pan-African. They are Black British. They are cordoning off the possibilities of a diasporic Black consciousness. They're very much a Black British sensibility, which Sir Steve is projecting. And it's important that we don't lose track of that sentiment, which runs through every single film. In whatever we think about the films, what they are not is Pan-African.
Yeah.
I just wanted to just throw in very quickly that one of the reasons why I do think it's so important to keep focusing on these products and what they are meant to, what function they're meant to play in the world, is that even as we do try to create alternative spaces, physical or intellectual, these products penetrate those spaces, and they penetrate the spaces that the communities we're trying to build with exist in. So that's so we can debate we can debate the impact of propaganda. We just have to, I think, be clear on the intent of it. So that, even as we've seen around in my limited experience with Pan-African autonomous education systems, spaces, African-centered schools, etc., in Baltimore and DC, here in the United States, one of many problems that they have continued to struggle against is the propaganda that reaches the communities that should theoretically be protecting, supporting, housing them. So we often do see cases where surrounding Black communities are saying, I don't really, why do we need this school? I don't care about this, and I don't care about Kwanzaa, and I don't want my kid in a dashiki, and I don't want, and in part because they're responding to the messaging that they're getting, that we may not succumb to or focus on, but I think often many in our communities do, and then politically they're not able to rise to the level of support that we would need. So, but other than that, obviously, we should be building all kinds of autonomous spaces, even as we're aware to their limitations, such as obviously YouTube, etc.
Look, Jared, I just want to quickly interject. It's something that I write about in Black Power in Bermuda, the creation of the police bus, and how as a response to Black Power, the British government, in collaboration with local white Bermuda government, designed all kinds of propaganda tactics that have lasted for generations. The primary concern was that they couldn't get Black people to join the police force, number one. So they had to bring in police officers from other parts of the Caribbean. And number two, they couldn't get Black people to testify in court or give information about Black Power organizations and uprisings. So how can we create trust within the Black community and the police department? And they created this system. They called in these propaganda experts from Britain who decided to take regular buses and paint them in police colors, and they would drive to our public schools, and each class would get out from class for about half an hour and go into these buses, and they would show us videos. And the videos, they would turn off the lights and show us videos. And the videos usually went like this: a little Black kid on a bike falls off his bike, police officer shows up, helps him out. It's friendly, take him to the station, it's nice. And then they send us back into the classroom. There'll be two police officers who would talk to us about the police force. One of them always had to be Black, and sometimes Bermudian. And for me, this is what I experienced in the 80s as a result of the Black Power movement of 1970s. And so years later, to look at the police records and see this intentional program. And I have to admit, as a kid, I love the police bus. I mean, what kid doesn't want to get out of class for half an hour? I mean, I'm leaving class first and ask them where I'm going second. So I look forward to to think through and to hear them talk about how, you know, they hope to reach each child across the public school system with this intentional propaganda. And, you know, and all these agents are being sent from London, from Britain. So imagine what's taking place within Britain itself, if they're so extensive in the extended, you know, reaches of colonialism. What's been the state's response to the memory of Black power and Black political organizing in Britain? Have Black people in Britain really faced that beast in terms of the necessary creation of maroon archives and how our traditions are remembered? And I see Zena's point, which I think is brilliant. You know, who are the other social media artists that are not ordained by the state? And I would ask both of you, you know, Horace Ove, it might be sacrilegious to even, I'm not making a comparison.
Careful.
But if they were to be put, if you put Horace Ove as pressure, for example, in this conversation, what then would we make of, you know, small acts? Because I think for me, that's in dub play culture, that's the counteraction dub that I think might win. I know for me, wins the argument of the importance of our own media structures. But I'm done.
But to the sister's point, that's sort of what I'm saying. That all I'm trying to say is we have to be clear what's going on here. So even as she's saying there's a lot of great media makers making use of the internet and social media, we have to remember that is largely U.S. military technology that we're being given an aspect of to play around with. They're also using this. They also have whole wings of the Pentagon targeting the use of social media and the internet for a whole host of reasons that are non-commercial. They have anyway. So they're talking about what they call full spectrum warfare. So that's all I'm saying. There's a lot of great media makers, including several involved in this call, this discussion, and our associated networks. All I'm simply saying is we struggle in a context where our enemies are using them too. So I grew up in the '80s watching cop and military TV shows, literally written by the State Department. That's one reason why we have thousands of cop shows. They're literally written by intelligence agencies and specifically to get us to not respond in the ways that many of us probably should be.
Right.
So I mean that's the reason. Again, they said that when I joined the Navy in the '80s, that I was a Top Gun recruit because I was responding to Tom Cruise's Top Gun movie, and here comes Top Gun 2 about to come out next year, and the same wars that my students weren't even born yet when that are coming to my class are still going on. So the process is still happening. And that's all I'm trying to say. That's the only part I would say that we have to understand and recognize, even to the extent we enjoy aspects of the McQueen and other series. That's the context that I'm just saying. Yeah. But anyway,
they're still doing it. I wanted to note that my daughter, before we moved back to the Washington D.C. area, in her public school, they had Police Are Our Pals Day, and they had a coloring book for the children. She was in kindergarten. She was 6, I think. And they gave them a coloring book and all these little vignettes where the police are being friendly with the children in your neighborhood. And I was so horrified. That was her first and last year at that school. But so they're still working on our children to create some sort of really weird relationship. And this is as that same Black community that we lived in was experiencing a horrible relationship with police and police violence. So thankfully now she's in an independent African school. I'm just plugging the school and just would like to say I'm so grateful that this space exists, and we do need more of these spaces. I think we do have a unique opportunity right now to expand the reach of the schools that we have, whether they're African-centered full schools or just Saturday schools. My daughter's school has expanded in the virtual moment that we're having. She has a science teacher in Central Africa. There are students and teachers who live in Ghana and Senegal. So her school went international overnight. And so now we can have a greater student population and also a wider Pan-African teacher population at her school. So we really do need to think about this, although at the same time, her school fully acknowledges that, you know, the more virtual they become, the more heavily surveilled they are, you know, now that they're not in only existing within, you know, someone's house, you know, in the community. So we just have to operate with the full knowledge that whatever we're doing, they see it. And think about how we can work online, yes, but also take a lot of our work also offline.
Can I come in?
Yeah.
Can I come in on that surveillance point? Sorry to cut you, sister. If you want to finish making your point, I'll come in afterwards. The point on surveillance, I think, shouldn't we can't stress it enough, really. We've been over-surveyed since the door of no return, and the question of surveillance runs right through my thoughts with regards to McQueen's films. I think McQueen's films are also in some way a form of surveillance. If we think about the cordoning off of other possibilities, other ways of conceptualizing our reality, other grammars of suffering. More importantly, just on a practical level, the Home Office under a Labour government back in the late 60s and early 1970s, they embarked upon a massive surveillance operation against Black liberation organisations in the mid to late 60s and the early 70s. And Frank Wilderson talks about this in one of his works, where he talks about, when he's talking about the BLA back in the 60s and 70s, and a relatively small number of activists, hundreds or maybe a few thousand, but yet this huge, intense effort of the imperial state to embark upon surveillance and ultimately extinguish those movements. Similar activities were taking place with the British state under a Labour Home Secretary, a Labour government in the late 60s, continued by Edward Heath and the Conservatives in the early 70s. Massive efforts of surveillance against a few hundred activists there, a few hundred there. We're talking, if we are talking, even if we're being generous, we're talking a few thousand. And that speaks to the huge anxiety which Sister Iyelli talked about when Iyelli talks about how suddenly the state is concerned when these educational spaces become a bit more organized, a bit more strong structurally. These small ecologies become a bit more established. Then it becomes more of a threat. And whenever there's more of a threat, the surveillance ratchets up. And then we have to speak about, included in that, we have to speak about our voice, our coerced voice. Again, Wilderson talks about every time we speak, we look over the left shoulder, we look over the right shoulder, and we wonder about the extent to which we can speak in civil society. And if we do speak, how much do we speak to our grammar of suffering without then attracting the violence which our existence attracts, that gratuitous vulnerability to violence, which comes to us in all manner, shapes and form, the more that we speak. And of course, Saturday schools, those Pan-African school spaces, are forms of speech, which again gets back to my original point, was why didn't McQueen really care? Deep down, why didn't he really care about getting speech right in any one of his films? He didn't really care. He's not a Pan-Africanist. He's not about speech. He's not about Black speech.
Wow. So we have been going for about an hour and 45 minutes. Are you guys all right to go for a little bit longer? You haven't got anything to like 15, 20 minutes maybe, and then we'll round up. Yeah, I've got the... Yeah, Jared's like, yeah, not really. Okay.
Yeah. No, I always hate to be the first one to leave anyway, but yeah, so
that's cool. Yeah, I've got my little ones downstairs, raging. So yeah, but I think the Saturday schools point is an important one. I wasn't aware actually that you guys in the States even had Saturday schools. In my head, I'm just like, this is British-based Caribbean phenomenon that that I've not really heard of with regard to other parts of the diaspora. So that's interesting to know, actually.
I don't think we have Saturday schools in the same sense, no, as they do in the UK. We have African-centered schools, though, that are just like full every day of the week, Monday through Friday.
Right.
Schools.
Okay.
Yeah.
And a number of different communities use Saturday schools or the concept to sort of autonomously teach their children what is not happening in mainstream schools.
Right.
But there is no structural, hey, African people gather on Saturdays to learn what we're not doing, elsewhere.
Okay. Yeah. So
there
are
homeschool collectives, African-centered homeschool collectives, different versions. Historically, liberation schools, coming out of civil rights traditions. There's a tradition for these other kinds of models too. Okay.
Yeah. So here in the UK, we don't have because we're so scant. The population is so scant. I don't think we probably couldn't sustain an actual school, to do these things. But I wanted to ask you guys a question with regard to gender, because we haven't talked about this really in this thing, and how you feel gender was kind of reflected in that in the series, and maybe as well if you've got any thoughts with regard to parent and child relationships. I know that what was it? Was it education? No, it was education. The parenting dynamic. For me, I found was like quite was really off. The mum basically wouldn't listen to the boy, telling him that he's being that he's being persecuted by the school system and so forth. And at one point, he beats her up, and it was quite harsh and really brutal and really stark. And I know a lot of people probably not pleased with that. I've got thoughts on that, but yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on either of those two things: the gender or the parenting.
I mean, can I first thing I'll say about gender? Steve McQueen does not love black men. He does not love black men. That's I'll say that in gender. He does not love black men. With regards to that question, you when you speak about parenting, somebody made a good point the other day on social media when they say that we have to remind ourselves that when we are growing up, we're also watching our parents grow up. And so we as the first generation here in the UK, we're watching our parents grow up in this hostile environment of the UK, thinking they were coming to the mother country, experiencing huge levels of discrimination. We've talked before, Ellie, how strong and powerful the racist National Front was at the time, the British movement, Margaret Thatcher talking worried about immigration because they're going to get swamped. 1981, when the police occupied Brixton, they actually called the Operation Swamp. This geo-racial politics of filth. So our parents were growing up at that time, and as well as bringing us up. And I know me and my older brother and sister, when we went to school, Mum would say before we left the door, "And what are you going to school for? Manners and education, Mum. What are you going to school for? Manners and education, Mum." And I'm sure we weren't the only kids brought up by a Jamaican mother who said that. Yeah, they had a faith, they had a belief in the school system, and they were betrayed by that British school system. They thought they were coming to a Britishness which they believed they had some aspect or shared when they were in the Caribbean. And so one has to look back and recognise that there was Education for me was the best film of all of the films because it spoke to my truth the most. A mother who was deeply invested in the education system, wanted the best for her children, but by and large trusted her children in the care of the British system. And when we came home and said, well, this teacher's a bit racist and whatever, we had to unguilty ourselves. We had to sort of unguilty ourselves before we could, is that a word, unguilty? I'm giving it a run. Let's see how it flows. We had to unguilty ourselves before Mum would even listen to us, if she would listen to us at all, or we had to probably just not tell our parents. because there were consequences for that. And with regard to the father element, I'm going to continue to be a bit autobiographical. My father had very, 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 very little to do with. He never went to a parents' evening, and that's not because he couldn't care less about our futures. It's because there was a divide in terms of the responsibilities as to who did what in terms of the children. And so when I saw that film and the mother deeply involved in what was going on with the kids, but the father having other kind of burdens upon his soul, I kind of got that. Not saying I agree with it, but I kind of, that depiction was in some way truthful to me.
Quito, I think you were going to say something.
Well, I mean, I just think in education, I think for me, I'll just address it from the overlap of parenting and the gender dynamic. Education is very much the heroes in that film are Black women. The mother goes through a transformation process where she goes from being, a parent who is not paying attention to her son to she starts to believe her son only at the intervention of two other Black women who one had to, literally break into the school. It's not a school, disguised as a journalist to get the list of names. So it also spoke, I mean, for me, that also spoke to the need at some point, Black people, we have to just break these rules. We have to just break these. But it ends problematically with a call to Margaret Thatcher. As the mother, I'm going to write a letter to Margaret Thatcher, Secretary of State, because she's a woman that maybe this will help us. Like it's this notion of this white womanhood now is going to help, and look how that turns out for Black folks, right? And
yeah, that was a bizarre.
That was extremely bizarre. That was like that did not have to be there. All the things. That does not have to be there at all. Like why? And so right. So you say, but sticking to the question, I thought that was, the Claudia Jones is mentioned. There's a reading of, an African Queen, Nigeria, Amina. So there are these, for me, these intentional, arrow points towards Black women. That get doubled with parenting, but even to Jared's point, right, of the propaganda of the state. And on one hand, what's historically real, if it's real, it's real. So I think the reading from an actual text that's being used at the era about African civilizations, but I guess it's a text of its time. So it also references slavery in Africa, which is kind of like the film ends with the reading a book about an African queen who has walls built around a compound in Nigeria. Check. Okay, Africans can build walls. Okay, Nubia, okay, right? Okay, it's great. Built by slaves. It's like, wait a minute, like why? Like you end with that. So, so I think he was trying to, and me and Yeli actually talked about, the gender dynamic in Lovers Rock. So I won't say much about that, but I felt like in education, he was trying to deal with both of those, at least from terms of gender, in terms of Black womanhood. But to Kevin's point about Black malehood, it's like you don't know where it's coming from. You don't know what you don't know where. You don't know how it's going to make these pictures. Although I would say, for him, right, there's this moment of Black masculinity where the dread in prison hugs the youth. And says, you know what? Tell me your story. So there's this.
After he beats him down a little bit.
I'll stop. Go ahead,
no, I was just gonna say because I really like that scene, and because of and I won't go into it, but it was very personal, just in terms of like the elder, younger. Manhood, transmission, study, student, teacher aspect of it. Like that scene in particular, I really, in the context of it happening in prison, that said a lot for me. And my reaction is always, I hate that it's happening in this commercial context. Like, I hate when things that speak to me happen in these contexts. That's why I'm saying, like, I'm very suspicious of the whole thing. Like, I hate it. The only thing that I would want to say about the specific questions, when I saw the scene of the relationship between the mother and the son, and then the violence that she suffers at the hands of the son. Excuse me, I can't even speak on it. Obviously, it's a struggle. Honestly, the first thought that I keep having is, I admit that my bias is I keep reading these as products that are targeting a white affluent audience. That success is measured by how many white people with money will continue to subscribe and watch and like and talk about and review. Just even a negative review is big at this point. So that's what I'm always, and I kept hearing this theme. I admit that went back heavily to this country's story about the product that was created about Oscar Grant in the Fruitvale Station discussion of the need to humanize Oscar Grant, so that white people would see his humanity and therefore then change their relationship to the violence that Black people suffer at the hands of the police here. So, and I say that to say that when I see the strained relationship in Red, White, and Blue with the father and the son, which had its own set of conversation for me personally as well, by the way, and then the mother and so in terms of both parenting and gender. All I'm hearing is this is an attempt to, quote unquote, humanize Black people for white audiences. And part of that humanizing always seems to need to talk about some sort of negative aspect of the relationship. Again, not with an overt conversation about the context in which all of this is happening. So whatever my emotional response was, that was my initial read. It was like, dang, man, look at this context. And why do we have to see this relationship? We see so little of Black women. We see so little of Black families. Why is this the version of the relationship? And then the last point about the references to women and Claudia Jones, my real point would be, even a commercial product trying to be better or more honest, and this would contradict many of my other positions, but you could argue that you could do this by making a series that centers the life of Claudia Jones. And then if you want to tell all of these other stories about parents and gender and relationships or sexuality or whatever else you want to, if the context is Claudia Jones, it might force something else that again would be a problem for me, but others might find a more value. Anyway, that's where I was at with that initial response to that question.
Cool. And Sister Iyelli, did you have?
Yeah. When I watch things like this, I'm always wondering what's going on with the Black women, for obvious reasons. Not just because that's my research area, but because it's who I am. But to the point that Riverman made, I found most of the Black women characters were one-dimensional, just really shallow or hollow. And I feel like even after the conversation I had with Quito about this, I've thought about it some more, and I'm really clear about why Steve McQueen would present Black women this way, or just not present them. You know what I mean? Not present them. Even the scene that I mentioned earlier where the Black women are kind of being gently kind of led to the dance floor or whatever, you don't see their faces. It's like the shoulders down, or the mom at the end of that episode, she's just a voice that says, get up, let's go to church. Like there's an invisibility and a silencing. The very meek wife in Red, White, and Blue, who kind of just lets this like overbearing father husband, terrorize the son around his decision to join the police force. Everyone's tiptoeing around this guy, including the mom. The aunt, who kind of encourages him, she's kind of shallow too. We don't understand really her logic and why she's a police liaison, what led her to that decision. The wife who's encouraging him to become a cop or a body. Why is she pushing him to do this instead of lab work? Like, what? We don't understand any of these Black women. There's no subjectivity. There's no real understanding of the decision making. They don't have, I think, whole emotions. Even the young women at the party in Lovers Rock, and I think someone made a point about this way earlier in the chat, which is these just young girls with like stank attitudes and pettiness and cattiness, and they're just hating on each other without knowing each other. I kind of initially thought, well, it's a 17-year-old's birthday party. Maybe this is just a function of them being really young and immature. But then I was just like, no, because that party was multi-generational. There were older folks at the party, which I appreciated because I partied with my mom and them too. But it was there was a backbiting kind of just, again, shallowness. I feel like Steve McQueen's view of Black women is on full display in this series. What he doesn't know about us, what he doesn't see about us, what he doesn't know about our value in families and in communities. I did not see the last film. I did not see Education, so I can't join that part of the discussion. So I definitely have to now go watch that and learn more about what's being said relative to Saturday schools and all of that. But I even hear the critiques about how the sister was portrayed in Mangrove, being that she's such an important historical and political figure. I could definitely see where there may have been some lapses and some gaps. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that. I kind of echo all of your other sentiments about the way family is portrayed.
Fantastic. Okay, all right. So you know what? It's 5:30 here in the UK, 12 in Eastern. And Quito, are you in the US or Bermuda?
I'm on the East Coast.
East Coast.
Yes.
All right. So we've it's been an amazing conversation, man. So like you guys have seen so many things in these films that I just either just skirted past and just completely didn't think anything of it, and now I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna have to go and watch all 5 of them again to like pick up some of these nuances that you guys have picked out. It's been a really, really excellent and for me at least engrossing and informative and inspiring conversation. So thank you each and every single one of you guys. Sister Iyelli Ichile, Brother Jared Ball, Brother Quito Swan, and Brother Kevin Bismark Cobham. Thank you so much for joining this, and hopefully, at least some of you will join us again. We'll do something like this again, whether it's on one of our other channels. And I want to send a shout as well to Jared specifically, because right now you're doing this B-span thing, and you're taking over the airwaves right now. I'm like, I go on to try and schedule a live stream. I'm like, this dude's doing like 3 live streams today. He's got 4 live streams tomorrow. There's no space in the span for the rest of us.
We'll better coordinate. We'll better coordinate. I'll better coordinate.
No. That was to say, keep doing it and keep doing more of it, because you're doing a really important job in kind of bringing people together. It's because of you that I've been connected with, Yeli and Quito. And I just want to encourage everyone to subscribe to Jared, to I Mix What I Like, and all these different platforms. Iyelli Ichile, you're on Instagram, I believe. Is that your main kind of thing?
I'm really active on Facebook, but I am on Instagram. It's just my whole name.
Okay, yeah, so fine, yeah, and Quito, Kevin, you're a Facebook man as well. Quito, you're Twitter. Is that probably
yes?
Yeah. All right. Good. And yes, Kevin, very
real quick. I just want to respond very quickly that I appreciate the kind words, but I'm just trying to pay back the favor, because it's been a couple of years now that you reached out to me and put me in touch with Kevin and all your work. So I really appreciate having had that happen too. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And peace, everybody.
Thank you for having me too. Last thing I wanted to say, modernity. I've talked about this theory everywhere, but that was not present. And I think that's an indication of, if you're going to talk about these movements and these struggles of African people, and I walk away with this cold feeling, it's because we're not actually behaving toward each other the way I think we naturally do in the world. And I want to put up the name of Althea Jones LaCoin. Said, please, thank you, Blood Honey, for reminding me. And I do hope the next time that I'm able to join you, that there are some other sisters in the conversation.
I would love to. Oh, that's my aim. That's definitely my aim. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. And yeah, you guys have a great rest of the day. Everyone in the chat, thank you so much, everybody. Too many people to mention in the chat. Thank you for all your comments and input. Have a blessed day. Have a blessed evening. Peace out, blessings, and see you next time.